do you want to draw some Transformers? So I said, yes. Being involved with Transformers was the thing that gave me my in to Marvel US. The comics industry went into a massive downturn, and that affected me personally and emotionally very, very deeply. I will definitely finish it, purely because I love the ending I've come up with. To provide something for other people, to inspire them is a real joy.
Hi, I'm Claire, founder of Open Stage Arts drama and singing classes for adults. Lots of the adults who come to our classes and online events are looking for a creativity that has been put on the back burner during their sensible grown-up years. I have found this to be true among other creatives too, so I've decided to find out more about the painters, photographers, writers, printmakers, actors, crafters, teachers, musicians, and more that have found or refound their creativity later in life. For this episode, I'm chatting with Andrew Wildman about the highs and lows of making a creative living. Andrew has worked as a graphic designer, illustrator, and storyboard artist. Things haven't always been plain sailing for Andrew, but he's used his life experiences to inform his latest publishing works. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Claire.
As a youngster, there was a particular field of creativity that interested you, which you have been lucky enough to pursue, with some ups and downs in between. Please tell me what it is you do.
A lot of people ask me that, and it's an interesting one to kind of define, really. So what I do as a job is I'm a storyboard artist for TV and film, working in animation and live action. I have been a comic book artist. I've illustrated books. But basically what I describe myself as is a pencil for hire. I'm essentially an illustrator, and I've plied my trade in all sorts of different industries, but I draw stuff. There we go.
Did you have an artistic childhood?
Not particularly. I mean, I pursued it like many children do, but in terms of my family background, there weren't any artists as such. My mother was encouraging because she always wanted to go to art college, but, you know, back in the dim and distant past, going to college was not something that all that many people did, especially if you came from a kind of a rural background like she did. But she was always interested in drawing. My father was an engineering draftsman, so there were certain skills and use of implements, you know, pencils and rulers and that kind of thing, which did have an influence on me. So in terms of my childhood and my upbringing, there was something, but not the kind of thing that I ended up doing.
And what about at school?
School's an interesting one because, like any toddler, I would draw and do a bit of painting. I didn't go to a nursery school. You know, this is back in the day where I think many people went straight from being at home with their mum, you know, their stay-at-home mum while dad went to work. It was all very old-fashioned. It was very Ladybird book kind of upbringing. But yeah, so I would draw at home. One of my earliest memories of being inspired by creativity that was very, very close to home. I've got a brother, and he's two years older than me. So obviously he went to school 2 years before I did. But I can remember him coming back from this strange place that he went to every day called school. He'd made out of clay a fox's head, like a ceramic fox's head, you know, in a very kind of primary school kind of way. But nevertheless, it was just the head. And I was absolutely fascinated by it. Like it was a really well-defined shape. It's probably better in my memory than it was in real life. Things often are, you know. To me, in my memory, it was perfectly sculptured and painted and absolutely looked like a fox's head. And I was amazed that somebody that I knew, somebody who was that close to me, could create something so amazing. And it wasn't just drawing as well. It was a three-dimensional thing. So I found that incredible. So when I went to school eventually, as is the way with schools, you know, they regurgitate the the lesson year after year after year. So we came to the point where we were messing around with clay and making stuff. So I did exactly that. It was almost like, oh, I kind of know what to do here. I think the safest bet for me was to do something that I already knew was going to get a result. So I essentially copied him. I've never told him this. I'll ring him up after this. You were my earliest influence. So yeah, so that was the first thing that I remember being inspired by in terms of personal creativity. You know, not seeing something on TV or whatever, but actually seeing something that somebody I knew had made. So that was a very early inspiration. You know, I enjoyed doing the art lessons, and because I enjoyed drawing as a child, I think even before I was at school, family members would say very encouraging things like you do to children. And I took that very much to heart. I felt encouraged. I felt like it was a thing that I was able to do, and I enjoyed it, and other people liked it. So the kind of the feedback response there was a good one. So when I did go to school, I guess in some ways I was one step ahead of everybody else because I'd already taken it on as my thing. Oh, I'm Andrew, I can draw stuff, you know. As is the way with childhood, everything goes great and the world is wonderful and life is you know, it's always sunny until it isn't. They do say around about the age of 4 or 5, something comes up to challenge you and has you ask your first question about yourself and your identity, you know. That first thought of there's something wrong. There was a new lad came to school. If memory serves, his name was Kevin. And unfortunately for me, he was really good at drawing. So I can vividly remember it. It was in the first year of junior school, so I would have been about 7, I guess. And he'd done a drawing, and people, you know, other kids who had crowded around his table, and they're looking at his drawing, and they're like, "Oh, look, this is really good. This new boy, he's really good at drawing." And I was already feeling a little bit confronted by that because that was my thing. And I can remember somebody turning round to look at me from this little gathering around his table. And they said to me, "Oh, looks like you've got competition." And I was just mortified. It's like, this is my manner. You're stealing my thunder. Um, so it made, I guess it had a double effect. It was disappointing. It made me realise that nothing is a given, I suppose. Not that I would have phrased it that way to myself, but you know, in hindsight, it was one of those points where nothing is a given. Nothing is necessarily as you think it is. Things come along and challenge that. So I think what that did to me was have me draw back a bit. I was confronted, so I drew back. But I think at the same time, it also had me up my game a little bit. My enjoyment of drawing had been slightly knocked, but it's like I wanted to try harder, and just for myself. I wasn't a competitive person. I didn't necessarily want to be better than the other, you know, than the new boy Kevin. But I just wanted to feel that for myself, I was doing it well.
Yes. Did you have a style? Had you discovered comics by then?
I read comics right from when I was very, very young. I remember having a comic called Play Hour. I can still remember some of the characters in it. Little Tommy Trouble and Bunny Cuddles, the funny bunny who loved eating jam. It's wonderful. So I liked that. I liked picture books as young children do, but there was something about comics that felt a little bit more immediate. It was a lot of pictures, and the words are very much part of the images. Whereas with picture books, you know, you'll have one picture that then encapsulates quite a lot of the narrative in a way. But comics is very much beat by beat, very much what I do now. Images for every beat of the story. You know. And then we had classic British comics like the staple diet of football comics and war comics, because, you know, to be a real boy, you've got to be interested in football and war. But it wasn't until probably around well, certainly the mid-60s, I guess. We went on holiday to Devon. So we stayed at a caravan site, and in the little shop on the caravan site, they had a rack with some American comic books in, and I'd never seen American comic books before. So they had, I still have the first one I bought, which was an Avengers comic, Avengers number 44, I think, and Spider-Man, and Captain America, all those kind of things. And I was absolutely blown away by these things. These were not just comics about football and war. These were comics about real larger than life characters, but there was so much drama in them. And even though I didn't understand a metaphor at that age, you understood how very, very normal sort of human condition is being played out large by superheroes. And I was also fascinated by the drawing style, because the difference between American comics and British comics was that British comics were very illustrated, almost in a classic sense. There's lots of shading, pen and ink drawings, whereas American comic books were very much just line, and shock horror, they were in colour. I mean, we didn't have an awful lot of colour in our comics or our life, but America, so America became this amazing place, almost like this fairy tale land where they had these amazing stories and comics in colour. So that was when I became absolutely hooked on comics, and that influenced, like you asked me if I had a drawing style, that was the thing that then defined my drawing style more than anything else.
Yeah.
It wasn't just in terms of style as well. The other thing that sort of ran alongside that and kind of reinforced it as well was that I, like many children, I had a love of cartoons, really, really loved cartoons, on the TV. So like Disney and those kind of cartoons. My mother had a picture book of Lady and the Tramp, the Disney classic. The images, were taken from the animation. They weren't drawings done by somebody else or whatever. I used to try and copy them, but I could never get it quite right. So I would trace them, but because in the house we didn't have much in the way of art supplies, so I would pinch sheets of greaseproof paper from my mother's kitchen drawer and trace the characters. I mean, I was doing it because I wanted to do a drawing that looked exactly like the character, but what was happening that I was possibly not aware of at the time was that by doing that, it really was creating an understanding of, and almost muscle memory, as to how lines, very, very few lines, can be used and constructed to create what you perceive as very complicated characters. Because to make an animation, you have to be really economic with line. Otherwise, you'd never get all the drawings done. So they really do bear it down to its absolute minimum, and yet you can create a whole character full of emotion. That was fascinating, and definitely something that I was absorbing while doing that.
Yeah. Do you think that knowing what you were good at and what you enjoyed doing, do you think that informed your secondary education and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, having brought up children myself, I know that when a child becomes a teenager and then is looking at what they're going to pursue in life, you cannot tell them what to do. The only thing that will make a difference to a young person then moving forward into their own life is for them to find something that inspires them, because then they will apply the energy and the time. You can tell young people what they should be doing, but they'll hear it, but they won't take any notice. So, and it was the same for me, I think, because I was so interested in drawing. I was on a singular path of wanting to do that. Really, I passed the 11 plus as we used to have it in the old days. So at the end of your primary school years, you do an exam to see which school you'll go to, which then defines what level of education you'll have in secondary school, which is pretty crucial at such a young age. for whatever reason, I did really well in the 11 plus, and I got a scholarship. So I went to an all boys school with, to quite a large extent, a very classic education, not necessarily in the classics, although we did do Latin in the first 2 years. So I had a very good education, but I didn't do particularly well academically because the only thing that really interests me was art and geography, because I liked doing all the diagrams of strata and all that kind of stuff. So I was already beginning to think, what do you have to do to have an art career? I said earlier on about how my mother was always very supportive. I grew up as a Methodist, and my parents would go to chapel. And she met somebody at chapel. She came back to me and she said, "Oh, I met this person, and he's a commercial artist," which was the first time that we as a family, I guess, or me and a parent, had realised that there was a possibility of doing that as a job, because a job in art or making money in art was always something that was just so far removed from the reality of somebody growing up in a suburb of Bedford. So that was quite interesting. So that fed into my fantasy of, I might be able to draw comics one day. It was almost like the dream of being a rock star. It's not going to happen, but you have those dreams. But it just seemed like maybe there was some possibility. So I was interested in pursuing art, and I was encouraged, not in any way to pursue the career as a comic book artist. I mean, there was just nobody was interested in that at all. But I was encouraged to do art at school, got an A for my O level, and I managed to scrape together 4 O level results. Now, to get into the sixth form at the school I went to, you had to get a minimum of 5 O levels. But one of the teachers championed me a bit, and he said, "I think Andrew would do really well in the sixth form." He was so close to actually getting probably 6 O levels, but I just missed getting the required C for a couple of them. So they decided that I could go into the sixth form. So I studied the bizarre combination of, I think it was maths, economics, and art. Art was a given because I'd got an A, and the other two, I'd done really well at maths, bizarrely. So I did that, and then they thought economics would sit nicely alongside that, and for goodness sake, give me more chance of getting a job. So I did 1 year of the sixth form, and it wasn't going particularly well. But I can remember at the end of one of my economics lessons, the economics teacher, whose name was Mr. Butler, he said, "Wildman," because we're all referred to by surnames, there was no first names at that school, "stay behind at the end of the lesson, I need to talk to you." I was like, "Okay." And he said, "What are you going to do then?" And I said, "I'm just going off to my art lesson." And he said, "No, not now, you fool. What are you going to do? You can't stay here. You're not good enough." That's the way he said it. What was the intention behind what he was saying, I will never know. How he was hearing himself saying it, I will never know. But that's how it landed with me. You can't stay here. You're not good enough. So that was a hell of a blow. So I went off to my art lesson, and a friend of mine, Robin, he was already there. And I said to him, "You'll never guess what's just happened." He said, "What?" And I said, "My supposed personal tutor, which was Mr. Butler, who I didn't even know was my personal tutor, he's just told me that I've got to leave because I'm not good enough to stay here." And Robin looked at me and he said, "They've just told me I've got to leave as well." I was like, wow. I said, "What are you going to do?" And he said, "I'm going to go to Barnfield College and I'm going to study graphics." And I was like, wow, it's amazing. I said, "What's graphics?" And he said, "I don't know. I think it's drawing and stuff." So I thought, drawing and stuff, that sounds good. I want to go to Barnfield College and do drawing and stuff. So I went home and told my parents the news that I couldn't stay at school because I wasn't good enough, and they were fine. They were disappointed because they had high hopes for me to be some kind of Oxbridge candidate like a lot of the kids at the school, but clearly that wasn't going to work out. So my dad took me to Barnfield College to talk to the tutor there. Now, this was very late in the year, just before the summer holidays. So the guy from the graphics department, he showed us around. I was like, yeah, this is great. I want to do this. And he said, well, places are all taken now. We haven't got any availability. And then he said, where do you live? He was wondering how close to the college I was. And I said, well, I live in Bedford. So he said, oh, well, why don't you go to Amanda College in Bedford? I was like, I don't know. I didn't really think of that. Nobody ever mentioned Amanda College, which is a bit ironic because my dad did some of his studies at Amanda College. But anyway, so I went to Amanda College and did a arts foundation course, which is like a course prior to then going on to doing a degree. So you study all various disciplines, which of course I wasn't interested in printmaking or pottery or anything like that. I just wanted to draw comics. But of course, the other thing was I wouldn't be able to get onto a degree course from there without getting my art A level. So they said, you need to do a painting. I was like, okay. And they said, go into this other little side room, other little side studio, there wasn't anybody in, and do a painting. It's like random. Okay, so and I literally just took my shoes off, put them on the table, and did a still life painting of my shoes, and got my A level. Yeah, and then from there, did that 1 year course, and then from there, got a place at Leicester Polytechnic, or De Montfort University, as it's known now, and did a degree in graphic design, drawing and stuff.
Amazing. I know you worked as a graphic designer, but you continued to seek out illustration work. How did your career progress?
Yeah, because I'd got a graphic design degree, I'd got that in my pocket, so that was a qualification. But even through the 3 year graphic design degree course, I didn't do an awful lot of graphics, to be honest. On the graphics course, you could specialize in like editorial graphics, advertising graphics. You could also specialize in animation or photography or illustration. And I chose illustration, which was a bit of in some ways, it was a bit of a flip of a coin for me because I'd always, as I said earlier, I'd always been interested in comics, but I'd also always been interested in animation and cartoons. I was an avid watcher of a program called the Do It Yourself Animation Show. I think it was on BBC by Bob Godfrey, who did Rhubarb and Custard. And I loved all of that, and I got his book, and so I understood all the the fundamentals of animation from a very early age. So I did have an interest in it, but not enough of an interest to pursue that as my specialism. It also sounded like hard work, whereas the illustration course sounded like I was so lazy. The illustration course sounded a bit of an easier ride, but I took the word specialised to heart, really. And every illustration project that I was given, where they tried to get you to engage with different disciplines, so there would be painting and sometimes using watercolour, sometimes using acrylics, sometimes using paper cutouts, all different styles of illustration. But because everything that I did looked like a comic book, it was all line and colour. And the other thing was that in the 3rd year, I'd started to take trips into London where there was gatherings of people who were interested in comics. There was something called a comic march. They still do them now. They were at Westminster Hall where people would buy and sell comics. They would have some comics professionals there. And in some ways, that was the beginning of the comic conventions, in its own small embryonic way. So I began to get to know some people in the industry. And then I joined something called the Society of Strip Illustration, which was mostly professionals, but they did have what they called associate members, who were people that were wanting to get into the industry. And this was in the early 80s, so like 82. And so at that age, I was already rubbing shoulders with people who were already working in comics, but were going to become big players in the comics industry. So that was an ideal way to understand how the industry worked, and also to kind of get criticism of the work that you were doing, constructive criticism. But I was in no way good enough. But I was determined. So in the meantime, I worked as a graphic designer, myself and Leslie, my wife, and a photographer, and a guy who was a businessman who'd worked for Tyne Tees Television. We set up a small graphic design company which ran for 3 years, and we did some good work. And then that company folded, and I went to work for one of our clients, which was a label manufacturing company. I ran their very small art department there, where we would do all the artwork for labels, mostly like washing labels. But in the meantime, I was beginning to get bits of freelance work from Marvel UK. In London, there was Marvel UK were publishing reprint material of stuff from America. So they were reprinting Spider-Man, Avengers, all that kind of stuff. But they were also starting to generate some of their own content. They were doing a Thundercats comic and real Ghostbusters comic, stuff based on TV shows, and they did a Transformers comic. I got an interview with them, and they looked at my portfolio and they gave me some work on the Thundercats comic. It was a good one to get, and all budding artists liked it because the Thundercats characters kind of looked like superheroes. You know, they were sort of human looking, but one was a bit like a lion, one was a bit like a cheetah, you know, this kind of thing. But so it felt like cutting your teeth, drawing kind of superheroes. So it was good stuff to get in the portfolio to eventually show to maybe one day Marvel in America. But so sometimes I would post the artwork into London, and sometimes I would take a trip down there if I was going to one of these comic creator meetings in London. So I took the artwork into the office to the editor, Steve White, handed it over, and sitting at the desk next to him, there was another editor, and it was the guy that did the Transformers comic. So he kind of peered across and he looked at the work that I'd done, and he was like, "Oh, nice work." I was like, "Oh, thank you." And he said, "Do you want to draw some Transformers?" So I said, yes. Now, I said yes because I just needed work. I wanted to kind of earn money. I was still working as a graphic designer, and certainly all my evenings and weekends trying to earn enough money to eventually go as a freelance, artist. So I would say yes to anything. On the inside, I was like, I don't even know what Transformers is. And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "Well, it's these." He showed me, and I was like, "Oh my god, it's robot! I don't want to draw robots. What do I want to draw robots for? I want to draw superheroes." Of course, what I didn't realise, it was another one of those seminal moments that you look back on, because being involved with Transformers was the thing that gave me my in to Marvel US. It was through them recognising the Transformers work that I did for Marvel UK that had them eventually ask me to do the American Transformers comic, which was the beginning of my whole kind of career as a comic book artist.
Amazing. So far, your story has been very positive and creative, and you're in the right direction, and everything's sunny and lovely.
I know.
But there is about to be a change for the worst through no fault of your own. Can you explain what happened and how that affected you both as a person and as an artist?
Yeah. So like, I kind of likened working in comics to like being a rock star. So like any budding rock star, it's going to go one way or the other. It can go really well, and then you can fall out of favour. My comics career was on an up. The work that I did on Transformers was recognised by other editors. So then they gave me work on a book called G.I. Joe, which was another toy book, but it was humans, essentially. So that was a step in the right direction. I eventually came off of G.I. Joe because myself and my wife, we'd got young children then, and our little boy, Frank, he asked me what I was drawing, and I became aware of the fact that I was drawing people shooting each other. That realization didn't sit very well with me as a father of young children. So I wanted to move off of G.I. Joe, and I was offered a book called X-Men Adventures, which was incredible because it was proper Marvel characters. It was an X-Men book, but it was an easy kind of stepping stone because it was a version of the book that was based on the animated TV show. It wasn't part of the kind of Marvel storyline as such. Nevertheless, it was X-Men. So I was absolutely thrilled. Got noticed for doing that. One of the covers that I did, issue number 6, I did a couple of thumbnails and sent them in, and the editor wasn't sure which one he thought would work. So he asked the guy who was in charge of all the X-Men books. He came back and he said, cover number 2 version. He said, do that one. And I said to the editor, you know what? I don't agree with him. And I could hear him almost go, oh dear. You can't say that to the boss. So I said, I really don't agree. I think cover number 1, the other sketch I've done, is much better. I said, can you go and ask him again? And he said, we don't normally do that. The boss's decision is final. But he said, this may well backfire on you, but I'll ask him. He was slightly annoyed about it, the guy in charge of the X-Men books, but his word back was, well, if he seems that determined, then let him do it. But I'm not happy.
Ooh.
So anyway, I did that, and the sales figures went up with that issue. Not only that, but that piece of artwork, it's been used on T-shirts and all sorts of different things, and you still see it pop up even today. So it was a hell of a boost to my ego. Then I was asked to do a Spider-Man book, which was then proper Marvel. This was, I was really, really doing well then.
Yeah.
And then I did a Venom book, which was amazing. So I felt like I was properly one of the team. We were at the mid-90s by then, and the comics industry went into a massive downturn. They'd had an incredible journey through the 80s and early 90s because of the popularity of things like Watchmen that DC published. A lot of collectors came in and started collecting comics. Not comics fans necessarily, but people who were investors, investing in issue number 1s of things and whatever. So there were a lot of investors coming in. But the bubble in that kind of burst in the mid-90s, and sales figures absolutely plummeted. It was a huge knock to the industry. So they were cancelling books left, right and centre. One of the books I was on was going to be cancelled, Spider-Man 2099. So they took me off of that. I managed to I flew over to America a couple of times to talk to different editors. And one of the editors I got on really well with, a guy called Nel Yomtov, awesome chap. He said, the only thing I can offer you, and he was going to be losing his job as well. Editors were being fired as well. He said, I've got 1.5 issues of a book called Force Works, it was essentially one of the Avengers books. And I gave it everything. Like I really upped my game like I'd never done it before. And to this day, that is still the best mainstream comics work I've ever done. But it was cancelled, and after that there wasn't anything, and so I was out of work just overnight, pretty much. Probably wasn't actually overnight. It felt like it. I'd gone from hero to zero very quickly. I did some UK stuff again. It was great. It was still comics, but it wasn't really, it wasn't what it could have been, and that affected me personally and emotionally very, very deeply, because I was born in 1961. Fantastic Four #1, which was the first proper Marvel comic, came out in 1961. There's a group of people of my generation who worked in comics that do kind of carry that thing where they were born the same year that Marvel started and ended up working for them. So not only was I out of a job, but I felt like in many ways, being overly dramatic, I know, but my childhood and my destiny taken away from me. And that resulted in a minor breakdown. I mean, literally a breakdown. I wasn't hospitalised or anything, but I ended up having a year of counselling, medication, all that kind of stuff. Because I had to reassess who I was, really, for myself, as a creative person. the other thing that happened for me personally was that experience was the beginning of my own interest in coaching, personal development, all that kind of transformation thinking. Why do people think the way they do? Why do sometimes things in life work and not work? And how emotionally we feel positive or negative about things, all that kind of stuff. My own counselling involved a lot of work with dream interpretation. She was a Gestalt counsellor, and she worked with dream interpretation as well. And I developed a huge interest around that.
As you said, you sought help through counselling and also the Landmark Forum, which I know you found beneficial. Can you tell me more about those experiences and what they've taught you?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that happened with the counselling, the one-to-one counselling that I had, and with the dream interpretation, was that I had an idea for a book about a character sort of in a dream world. It was like a fantasy story. And I told the story to my counsellor quite briefly. And she said to me, you ought to do that as a book, not because it would be fun as like a graphic novel, but because it will help other people, who suffer depression the same as you do. That was kind of it. That was left there. That she planted a seed of a thought then for me. Anyway, so life went on. I was working in the games industry. The counselling thing had done. I felt good. Life was good. I left the games company because I was offered a job by a woman who's working for a publishing company doing a series of children's books, and she needed somebody to work on those. And it was going to be a big run of books. It was almost going to be like a job for life. So I left the games company. Leslie was going to help me. And we started work on that. And we probably did 2 books. And then she lost her contract. Not Leslie, the woman that had given me the work. Which then meant I had the rug pulled from under me, because I was basically being subcontracted by her. So I went into another tailspin, another kind of a, personal, creative and professional tailspin. What happened at that point was the little office that I was renting, there was somebody in the office next to me, and he used to pop his head in the door every morning. Really cheerful chap. He was like full of life. And he'd always say, how you doing, Andrew? I'd be like, yeah, great. And we'd get on with our day. Well, that particular morning, he stuck his head in the door and he was like, morning, Andrew, how you doing? And I was like, yeah, all right, thanks. And he said, okay, doesn't sound like your normal self. What's going on? And I said, well, blah, blah, blah. The good old moan about life and my poor self, etc., etc. And he listened and he was great. And he said many things to me that made perfect sense about how maybe I could look at things slightly differently. And I was like, oh, that's great. That's really helped. And he said, have you ever heard of the Landmark Forum? And I said, no. So he told me about it. This seminar in London where I go to a weekend seminar. The seminar leader talks to a room full of people and, you'll have a breakthrough with all these things. So I had the typical kind of very British reaction of, sounds like a bit of a cult to me, And I thought about some of the things he said, and I thought about how at a dead end I was. I thought, I'm just going to do it. Like, what's the worst that can happen? I went along to it, not really knowing what was going to happen. And it was incredible. It really, really was incredible. The whole thing was based on sort of coaching and psychology and psychotherapy distilled down to a way that they sort of deliver it to you, just as like a course. And you talk amongst yourselves and everything, where you suddenly realize things about yourself. I realized how dramatic I had been about things, how I'd overreacted to circumstances in my life and felt powerless to do anything about it, blamed circumstances for my life not working out rather than just finding some inner strength and getting on with it, and so many things. It kind of held a mirror up to me and who I was and how I wasn't dealing with life very powerfully. So as a result of that, I did a couple of their other courses. One of them was a really good course. It was a 3-month course where you use the things you've learned and you develop a project. And most people do like a charity project. The project that I did was to raise money for street children in Cambodia to help give them an education, because I just thought we take for granted so much. Like, I used to moan about my privileged education. I still do. I now don't take that for granted. That was a gift. So I created this project where I kind of enrolled all the comics creators I know to donate a piece of artwork. I then put the word out to the comics sort of world fan base, that on one particular day there was going to be an auction on eBay, and it was amazing, and it was a very, very easy process, and we raised a good amount of money for the charity. For that charity was called Every Child. We did lots of other kind of projects around around that, and the project was called Draw the World Together. Nice little pun there. And we did events at other comic conventions, and in the end raised tens of thousands of pounds for charity, which was amazing.
Amazing.
Anyway, that was one of the things that I did as a result of doing one of the landmark courses, because I felt empowered to make a difference. My career definitely took off after doing those courses, because I just learned about myself. People learn about themselves in all sorts of different ways. But the other thing that it did was I made a commitment while I was there that one day I would put some of my interpretation of that kind of thinking into a graphic novel. I'd said that I was going to do it around dreams many years before, when I had my own counselling. And I did, and I eventually self-published it. It's called Horizon. It wasn't quite the same story that I'd spoken to my counsellor about, but nevertheless, it's a story that involves dream interpretation. It has like a layer to it that informs the reader in a way that enables them, if they want to have breakthroughs in areas of life where they feel stopped or challenged. And I made the protagonist of the book a 15-year-old girl. The book's also semi kind of autobiographical. So people say to me, "So did you used to be a 15-year-old girl?" And it's like, no, but I used to be a 15-year-old, and I know what it is to carry the angst of a 15-year-old. Well, myself and Leslie brought up 2 daughters, and I know what it is to deal with the angst of a 15-year-old girl. And it seemed like the perfect character to take the reader through that journey. But I've had plaudits by some amazing people. Famed Watchmen artist Dave Gibbons has read it and gave me a wonderful quote. He thought it was great. Will Gompertz, the BBC arts editor, I did a little radio show with him, and he read it, and he gave me a quote. Alan de Botton, the philosopher, broadcaster and writer, he read it, and he just said, beautiful. It's just, and it was so nice to feel all of that sort of feedback and feed through. So it was, in many ways, it was just things aligning. It was me and the skills I'd picked up as my years as a comic book artist aligning into something that I'm immensely proud of. And that makes a difference. It's just nice to use the skills that you have to provide something for other people. Providing entertainment is great fun and a joy, but to provide something possibly a little bit more to inspire them is a real joy.
Brilliant. And I know you're planning to do more of that. You've got Oxygen underway and plans for another one after that. Tell me more about those.
Yeah, so the Horizon is very much a comic book style graphic novel. The sort of layout and everything. The art technique's slightly different. It's a lot more gentle. But I always wanted to do another one. The thing I realised with Oxygen was that the people that pick it up and read it love it. People like Will Gompertz, industry professionals, love it. Fans who pick it up at comic conventions come back the following year and say, I really loved it. But what I also know is that it doesn't necessarily instantly appeal to what some people would say is my kind of obvious fan base, which is people who like Transformers and sci-fi and all that kind of thing. They'll flick through it, but it's not their thing, which is fine. So I thought, okay, so what if I do the same thing essentially, but in a different genre? And I settled on sci-fi, but like Horizon, I wanted to do it in like a very small sci-fi sense, as in a singular character with a companion going through environments, which is how Horizon works. And what happens within those environments creates great breakthroughs for the character. And then there's a denouement at the end for the reader that adds context and makes sense as to what the story is actually about. So I'm doing that with something called Oxygen, which will be a graphic novel, but at the moment I'm doing it in 7 separate comic book issues. One of the differences with Oxygen is the way that I've done the book. So Horizon was drawn, with all those kind of varying panel layouts that you see in comics. It was drawn pencil on paper, which I then scanned in and coloured in the computer. But in the intervening years, I've done a lot of work in TV as a storyboard artist, which is what I do now. I did it on and off for a few years, but now that's exclusively what I do for animation and for live action. But I wanted to do it as storyboard panels, so like screen-shaped drawings. So on each page, rather than an array of 5 different panels in different shapes, I wanted to do 3 horizontal panels, top to bottom. It looks like screen shots from a animation, if you like. And I was doing that ink on paper. But then during lockdown, myself and Leslie decamped from our studio in town to home, because we had to work from home. And all of the storyboarding that I do now, I do on a computer. It's still drawn. It's drawn on like something called a Cintiq. It's essentially a screen, but you can draw digitally on it. I thought, I can't do any Oxygen work during lockdown, which is frustrating because, my drawing board and my inks and everything are all in the studio in town. And I thought, I'm missing a trick here. I could just use the storyboard software to draw all of the Oxygen panels digitally. You can move it around. It's quite easy, economical in terms of time to be able to do it. So I started rattling through it during lockdown, and I did the first 2 issues quite quickly. That was an interesting kind of merging then of storyboard technique and comics, which was interesting, but also then the merging of all the sort of coaching, transformational thinking content as well. So yeah, Oxygen's going very well. It's moving ahead. I will definitely finish it, purely because I love the ending I've come up with, and I so want to draw that and get it done and see it, and other people to experience that. But yeah, as is the way with creatives, we're so full of ideas. I've already thought of the next one that I want to do after that. So taking the format of the book and the intention of the book and kind of like genre hopping. So the next one will be a horror book.
Cool. How can people connect with you?
I have a website, andrewwildman.art or .net. They both get there, but I quite like the andrewwildman.art. So you'll find everything about me on there. So there's examples of some of my storyboarding work, comic book work, information about Horizon, and information about Oxygen. You can find me on LinkedIn and Facebook.
Thanks ever so much, Andrew. Creativity Found is an Open Stage Arts production. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please feel free to subscribe, rate and review. If you would like to help fund future episodes, you can buy us a coffee. That's ko-fi, the online platform that helps creators receive financial support from fans of their work. Visit ko-fi.com/creativityfoundpodcast. If you have found your creativity as an adult and would like to talk to me for future episodes, drop me a line at Claire at openstagearts.co.uk. On Instagram or Facebook, follow at Creativity Found Podcast, where you will find photos of our contributors' artworks and be kept abreast of everything we're up to.